It is a freezing, moonless night in November 1942, somewhere in the damp woods just outside occupied Warsaw. A solitary German patrol moves slowly along a rutted dirt track, their heavy boots crunching against the frosty ground. The sergeant at the lead carries a pristine MP-40 submachine gun slung over his shoulder, his breath pluming white in the frigid air. Behind a tangled thicket of blackthorn, less than 3 feet away, a 19-year-old Polish resistance fighter holds his breath. His knuckles are white, not from the cold, but from the strain of clutching a smooth gray piece of stamped metal that looks more like a child's dime store cap gun than an instrument of war. It has no rifling in the stubby barrel, no safety catch, and contains only a single heavy lead bullet. The young man waits until the shadow of the German officer blots out the starlight, presses the cold muzzle directly against the thick wool of the sergeant's tunic, and pulls the trigger. The sound is not a clean, sharp crack, but a muffled, violent thud, accompanied by a shower of sparks and the heavy smell of cheap cordite. The German officer collapses into the mud before he can even register the flash. The resistance fighter does not reload. He cannot, for the process is far too slow. Instead, he drops the crude metal shell into the mud, scoops up the fallen sergeant's submachine gun and spare magazines, and vanishes into the darkness of the forest before the rest of the patrol can react. In less than 10 seconds, a $2 piece of junk metal, stamped out by factory machines in North America, has traded itself for the finest automatic infantry weapon in the Wehrmacht's arsenal. This was the terrifying, cold-blooded logic behind one of the strangest firearms ever produced in the history of modern warfare. It was known officially as the Flare Projector Caliber 45, a deliberate misnomer designed to throw enemy spies off the scent, but history would remember it simply as the Liberator. It was a weapon born not out of tactical elegance or marksmanship, but out of absolute desperation and a ruthless calculation of psychological warfare. It was a pistol designed to be given away by the hundreds of thousands, a disposable weapon meant to turn every dark alley, every quiet country road, and every domestic home across occupied Europe into a potential death trap for the German occupier. To understand why such a crude device was ever conceived, one must look at the grim reality of Europe in the early spring of 1942. The Nazi war machine had consolidated its grip on the continent, stretching from the Atlantic coast of France to the suburbs of Moscow. Millions of civilians found themselves living under a brutal reign of terror, where the slightest infraction meant execution or deportation to a concentration camp. Resistance networks were forming in the shadows, from the French Maquis to the Polish Home Army, but they faced a catastrophic underlying problem. They had virtually no weapons. The conventional Allied armies were already stretched to their absolute limits. Supplying organized military forces required every spare rifle, Bren gun, and submachine gun rolling off British and American assembly lines. Shipping heavy, expensive military hardware to underground partisan groups was an operational nightmare. Standard infantry weapons were heavy, required constant maintenance, and used precious cargo space in Allied drop planes. Furthermore, airdropping large crates of military rifles into occupied territory carried a massive risk. If a parachute drifted off course, a consignment of vital weapons fell straight into the hands of the Gestapo, instantly arming the enemy. What the underground movements needed was not an infantry rifle capable of engaging the enemy at 300 meters. They needed a mass-produced weapon that was light, small, immensely cheap, and capable of being manufactured in vast quantities without diverting critical machine tools away from frontline production. Existing military sidearms such as the British Webley revolver or the American Colt M1911 were engineering masterpieces, but they were complex, expensive, and took hundreds of man-hours to precision machine from solid blocks of steel. The Allies needed something that could be produced by the millions, distributed like propaganda leaflets, and used by completely untrained civilians who had never held a firearm in their lives. The challenge was presented to the Joint Psychological Warfare Committee in Washington, D.C. in March 1942. The brief seemed almost impossible. Design a lethal firearm that could be manufactured for less than the cost of a winter coat, produced in a matter of weeks, and packaged so compactly that hundreds could be dropped from a single bomber in a single night. The solution came from an unexpected source: the Guide Lamp Division of the General Motors Corporation in Anderson, Indiana. Under the direction of an eccentric and brilliant engineer named George Hyde, a team set to work turning the conventional philosophy of gunsmithing completely on its head. Instead of using expensive, time-consuming forged steel and precision lathe work, Hyde realized that a functional pistol could be constructed almost entirely from cheap sheet metal stampings, spot-welded together in the same manner as automobile headlights and tin toys. The resulting design, dubbed the FP-45, was a marvel of brutal simplicity. The pistol consisted of just 23 individual metal parts, held together by basic pins and rivets. The entire body was formed from two stamped steel halves welded down the center seam. The barrel was nothing more than a smooth-bore steel tube, precisely 4 inches (10.16 centimeters) in length, completely devoid of any internal rifling grooves. Without rifling, the bullet would not spin in flight, rendering the weapon wildly inaccurate beyond a distance of a few paces. But accuracy at range was never the point. The entire mechanism of the FP-45 was stripped down to the absolute bare minimum. It had no magazine, no ejector mechanism, no safety catch, and no slide. To load the pistol, the user had to manually pull back the heavy zinc cocking piece, twist it to the side, and slide a steel cover plate upward to open the breech. A single .45 ACP cartridge was then manually inserted directly into the chamber. The cover plate was pushed back down, the cocking piece was rotated back into alignment, and the gun was cocked. When the trigger was pulled, a heavy steel firing pin slammed forward, detonating the primer. After firing, the user had to lift the cover plate again and physically push the spent brass cartridge out of the barrel using a wooden dowel rod or a pencil, as there was no mechanical. The entire pistol weighed a mere 1 pound, 453 grams, and measured just 5.5 inches, 13.9 centimeters long. It was roughly equivalent in size to a modern paperback book, easily hidden in the deep pocket of an overcoat, tucked into the waistband of trousers, or concealed inside a hollowed-out loaf of bread. The cost of production was a staggering $2.10 per unit, equivalent to roughly $40 today. Manufacturing began at the Guide Lamp plant in Indiana in June 1942. The speed of production was unlike anything the firearms industry had ever witnessed. While a standard military rifle took dozens of hours to assemble and test, the Guide Lamp factory was stamping out complete Liberator pistols in a matter of seconds. In an extraordinary 11-week period between June and August 1942, a dedicated crew of 300 workers manufactured over 1 million FP-45 Liberators. The factory was producing pistols faster than the workers could physically pack them into boxes. The packaging itself was a masterclass in psychological warfare design. Each Liberator was packed into a small, waxed, waterproof cardboard box coated in paraffin to protect it from moisture during storage and airdrops. Inside each box was the pistol, 10 rounds of .45 ACP ammunition, a wooden clearing rod for pushing out spent cartridge casings, and an ingenious instruction sheet. Because the weapons were destined for dozens of different countries across Europe and Asia, writing instructions in multiple languages was deemed impractical and dangerous for security. Instead, the Allied planners created a comic strip-style instruction sheet using clear, line-drawn illustrations that explained how to load, cock, fire, and unload the weapon without using a single written word. 5 extra rounds of ammunition could even be stored inside the hollow grip of the pistol, sealed behind a sliding metal baseplate.
The noise of firing the Liberator was described by contemporary testers as an appalling, deafening blast. Because the barrel was unrifled and extremely short, a significant portion of the gunpowder burnt outside the muzzle, creating a massive, blinding fireball and a sound roughly equivalent to a thunderclap at point-blank range. The heavy .45 caliber bullet, weighing 230 grains, left the barrel at a sluggish velocity, tumbling wildly through the air. Beyond 10 feet, hitting a target was largely a matter of pure luck, but at point-blank range, pressed against an enemy's back or rib cage, the massive lead bullet was devastatingly lethal, inflicting horrific, gaping wounds. Yet, as impressive as this manufacturing achievement was, the strategic reality of deploying the Liberator immediately ran into serious friction. If you are finding this historical deep dive interesting, a quick subscribe helps the channel more than you know.
The grand vision of dropping hundreds of thousands of liberators over occupied Europe hit a wall of bureaucratic skepticism and military disdain. General Dwight Eisenhower's staff in Europe viewed the weapon with intense skepticism. Professional military officers looked at the crude, stamped metal toy and saw a liability rather than an asset. They argued that arming untrained civilians with an inaccurate single-shot weapon would simply invite ruthless German reprisals against local villages without achieving any real military objectives. Furthermore, the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces were deeply reluctant to allocate precious bomber sorties to drop crates of toy-like pistols when those same aircraft could be carrying heavy explosives to blast German industrial centers or dropping actual Sten guns and Bren light machine guns to organize partisan forces. As a result, the vast majority of the 1 million Liberator pistols manufactured in Indiana never saw combat in Europe. Hundreds of thousands of units were shipped to warehouses in England, where they sat in sealed wooden crates, untouched for months. The Special Operations Executive, the British Covert War Organization, took delivery of a limited number, but kept them largely in storage, preferring to airdrop the reliable, cheap British Sten submachine gun, which cost only about $11 to make and offered 30 rounds of fully automatic fire. Records remain spotty and highly classified regarding precisely how many Liberators were actually dropped into occupied territory. Estimates suggest that only 25,000 to 50,000 units were ever dropped over France, Greece, Yugoslavia, and China. In the Pacific Theater, the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, had somewhat better success distributing the Liberator to guerrilla forces in the Philippines and Burma, where Japanese forces maintained tight control over dense jungle villages and small garrisons. Where the Liberator was deployed, however, its true value was realized not in its lethality, but in its profound psychological impact. The Allies never intended the Liberator to win battles. They intended it to wage a war of nerves. In occupied France and Poland, Allied radio broadcasts subtly hinted that vast supplies of small, easily concealed weapons were being dropped into every town and village. Leaflets were dropped over major cities warning German soldiers that any civilian walking past them in the street might have a concealed firearm hidden in his coat pocket, waiting for the officer to look away so he could execute him and take his loot. The psychological burden shifted. Instead of the occupied population living in constant fear of the soldiers began to fear the population. Patrols were forced to operate in larger groups, sentries grew nervous and jumpy, and German commanders were compelled to tie down thousands of extra troops simply to maintain internal security and search for hidden weapons caches. To fully appreciate the strange design philosophy of the Liberator, it helps to compare it directly to other emergency mass-produced weapons of the Second World War. The British, facing their own existential threat of invasion in 1940, had developed the famous Sten gun. While the Sten was notoriously cheap, made from stamped metal and bicycle tubing, it was still a fully functional 30-round submachine gun capable of firing 500 rounds per minute. It was light years ahead of the Liberator in terms of firepower, but it required far more steel, specialized machinery, and assembly time. The Germans, late in the war, attempted their own emergency weapon program known as the Volkssturm weapons, or People's Weapons. Designs like the Volkspistole were crude handguns made from stamped sheet metal created to arm old men and boys in the final days of 1945. However, unlike the American Liberator, the German emergency weapons were intended for frontline defense against advancing Allied armor and infantry, a role for which crude stamped pistols were catastrophically unsuited. The Liberator stood entirely alone in the history of firearm design because it was never meant to be a weapon of war in the conventional sense. It was designed as an economic and psychological lever. It was a tool to facilitate the capture of real weapons. The operational doctrine was simple. One Liberator, fired at point-blank range, yields one enemy rifle and one belt of ammunition. If a resistance fighter used a $2 Liberator to acquire a $200 MP-40 submachine gun from a dead sentry, the Liberator had achieved a 100-fold return on investment. Following the end of the war in 1945, the Allied military command faced a massive logistics problem: what to do with nearly 1 million unused, obsolete Liberator pistols sitting in warehouses across Europe and North America. Retaining them in military arsenals made no sense, since they had no practical utility for a modern peacetime army. The vast majority of the FP-45 Liberators met a quick and unceremonious end. Hundreds of thousands of unused, obsolete pistols, still sealed in their original paraffin cardboard boxes, were dumped into the Atlantic Ocean or melted down for scrap metal in industrial smelters across Europe and the United States. Military authorities saw no reason to preserve what they viewed as a temporary, cheap piece of wartime junk. Because so many were destroyed, the Liberator has become one of the rarest and most highly sought-after military handguns among modern historical collectors today. A pristine, original Liberator pistol, complete with its original cardboard box, wooden clearing rod, and pictorial instruction sheet, can command prices exceeding $10,000 at auction. A bizarre twist of fate for an object that was manufactured for just $2 in an Indiana lamp factory. A handful of surviving examples are preserved today in institutions such as the Imperial War Museum in London, the National Firearms Museum in the United States, and the Airborne Museum in Normandy, standing as silent testaments to one of the most unusual industrial experiments of the mid-20th century. When we look back at the story of the FP-45 Liberator, we're forced to re-examine our understanding of what makes a weapon effective. In the popular imagination, warfare is defined by powerful machines, high-precision engineering, and overwhelming firepower. We celebrate the sleek lines of the Spitfire, the heavy armor of the Sherman tank, or the mechanical reliability of the M1 Garand rifle. Yet the Liberator represented a completely different kind of warfare, one that recognized that human psychology, paranoia, and the constant unseen threat of violence can be just as devastating to an occupying army as an artillery barrage. It was a weapon stripped of all beauty, all craftsmanship, and all military grandeur. It was ugly, it was awkward, and it was inherently dangerous to the person firing it. Imagine again that moonless night in November 1942. The young Polish partisan disappears into the dark woods, the heavy German submachine gun cold against his chest, leaving behind a dead sentry and a small empty zinc shell resting in the frozen mud. That discarded piece of stamped steel had performed its single intended function. It did not need to be fired a second time. It had converted a desperate, unarmed civilian into a fully equipped insurgent fighter, shattering the illusion of safety that the occupying forces had built around themselves.
The Liberator was never about the steel, the lead, or the powder. It was about the terrifying idea it represented, that anywhere, at any time, an unarmed populace could reach into the dark and strike back. It proved that in the crucible of modern total war, the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield was not the most expensive or the most advanced, but the one that forced your enemy to fear the dark.